I want to take you to see three cemeteries on Benning Road. One cemetery will be obvious, but the other two may be a big surprise to most people. Some of your grandparents may remember this information. So let's travel down to the 4600 block of Benning Road and C Street, and we will start with the obvious one, the Woodlawn Cemetery. Woodlawn Cemetery sits next to the Benning Road Co-op Apartments in the Benning Ridge neighborhood of Southeast DC. Woodlawn is a historic cemetery that opened on May 13th, 1895. With approximately 36,000 burials at the 22.5-acre cemetery, nearly all of them were black residents. Now, let me take you across the street and show you where another spot that was a black cemetery used to be. Across the street is a steep grassy incline with a lot of trees on it. But on the top of that hill is the old Fletcher Johnson Elementary School. Fletcher Johnson opened its doors to students in 1977, but it was built on top of an old graveyard. It was the Payne Cemetery. John Payne was a black man that owned a farm with his wife and kids in the Marshall Heights neighborhood. Mr. Payne was a carpenter by trade, but he used 14 acres of his land to establish a cemetery for the black residents of DC in 1851. But it wasn't until 1896 that the Payne Cemetery Association was chartered in order to own, manage, and maintain the cemetery. There were about 14,000 burials in the Payne Cemetery between 1880 and 1919, but there were clearly many more people buried at Payne's graveyard that the cemetery or official records had shown. That's because there were a lot of unmarked graves. There were unidentified burials along with the identified ones, and also the illegal burials, or shall I say, the bootleg burials. The bootleg burials were made very late at night without the cemetery's knowledge. It was common practice in communities whose residents couldn't afford the price associated with an official burial. And this was very true of the Payne Cemetery, which catered to the poor and the working poor. In the mid 1900s, Payne Cemetery Association sold the graveyard to P.D. Badia. Burials at the cemetery ended in 1959. Badia later sold the cemetery in March 1961 to Lewis H. Bell, a white real estate developer who purchased a number of abandoned or nearly abandoned black cemeteries in DC. And that would include also the Woodlawn Cemetery across the street. Bell claimed to have moved more than 37,000 bodies from the Payne Cemetery to National Harmony Memorial Park Cemetery in PG County, Maryland, between March and November 1961. As the graves were moved, Bell ordered more than 500 short tons of field dirt to be placed on top of the 12 acres of the cemetery to smooth it out. Unfortunately, Bell did not move all the graves, and some family members complained that their loved ones were now buried under several more feet of dirt. After complaints were made to the Corporation Council of DC, Mr. Bell agreed to uncover these graves and restore the cemetery's plot boundaries so that the families could find the burial sites of their loved ones. In 1966, about 2,000 graves were transferred from Payne Cemetery to National Harmony Memorial Park Cemetery. Payne Cemetery was declared abandoned by the city in the summer of 1966, and all the graves were declared moved by September 1967. Fletcher Johnson Elementary School opened January 1977, for a partial school year because the assistant principal said classes were being phased in. Now, follow me much further down Benning Road in the opposite direction to a spot that many people had no idea used to be a graveyard. I posed a trivia question in a previous video about Benning Road's geography. What DC intersection has 2 roads, 2 streets, and 2 avenues? And we land right here at the intersection of Benning Road, Bladensburg Road, Florida Avenue, H Street, Maryland Avenue, and 15th Street. The center of this intersection is this small park called the Starburst because of the shape that it makes when all the intersecting streets connect to it. It's right here at the Starburst that I want to show you our 3rd graveyard. It was called Graceland. Well, this small space wasn't all of the cemetery. From Bladensburg Road, it stretched to K Street, 17th Street, and back down to Benning Road. Heckinger Mall covers half of that area now. Graceland was a 30-acre cemetery located in the Carver-Langston neighborhood in Northeast DC. It was founded in 1871 as a privately owned cemetery not affiliated with any religion and was open to the public, but it primarily served DC's black community. From 1884 to 1885, more than 1,200 bodies were transferred to Graceland Cemetery from Holmead's burying ground in Northwest DC. In August 1871, the DC Board of Public Health declared Holmead's burial ground a public nuisance and needed to be shut down because of the foul smells from the decomposing bodies. Graceland Cemetery was created due to the need for a large rural cemetery for the black community in DC. In the late 1800s, at the time, nearly all non-Catholic cemeteries in the city were racially segregated, with whites-only burial grounds refusing to bury black citizens on their property. By 1850, there were 16 cemeteries in the city of Washington, but only 3 served the black population: Old Ebenezer, the Harmonian, and Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery. On June 5, 1852, the DC City Council enacted legislation to stop burials at any burial ground inside of the limits of the federal city, and to ban creating any new burial grounds within the federal city, also called the Washington City. Back in that time, the federal city wasn't expected to fill the entire district, so most of DC's black population was in the forested rural section of DC, in Northeast and Southeast. The part of DC that was considered the country part is where the black people lived. And DC's growing black population desperately needed a new cemetery. In 1870, a group of progressive white citizens decided to buy a plot of land just beyond the border of the federal city and build a racially mixed cemetery. From 1871 to 1873, Graceland Cemetery was beautifully landscaped and plenty of trees were planted on it. Winding walkways were laid out through the cemetery's gently rolling hills, and an expensive caretaker's house was built on top of it. The southern half of the property sloped to the south, and there were several natural water springs in the area for the neighborhood's drinking water, and this area was somewhat marshy. The cemetery was on top of a hill which gave it excellent views of the city and the U.S. Capitol, while the bottom of the hill on Benning Road was wet and swampy. About 42,000 burial lots existed at Graceland. Lot prices were initially held low to encourage more burials. Lot prices ranged from $3 in the wet, marshy southern part of the cemetery to $22 for the prime hilltop section. Burial costs were also low. Opening and closing a grave just cost $4, while handling the body cost another $5. In comparison, at the highly popular and almost white Rock Creek Cemetery, opening and closing a grave cost $6.50. Although at times popular with the black community, Graceland never quite caught on. The Columbian Harmony Cemetery was DC's most popular black American cemetery at 9th Street and Rhode Island Avenue Northeast. Payne Cemetery was the second most popular. Graceland Cemetery was not very popular until 1890. A total of 4,722 black residents were buried there between 1880 and 1894. But it was the top burying ground in 1890 and 1891. At the time it closed, several hundred, if not thousands, of unused burial plots at Graceland were owned by black people. Although only 1,073 whites were buried at Graceland from 1880 to 1894, this was actually quite a large number for a racially integrated cemetery. By February 1893, there were 5,700 burials at Graceland. Most of them were in the 100-foot wide strip along the southern border of the property at Benning Road. Most likely because the lots there were the cheapest in the cemetery, largely due to the waterlogged area. Although Graceland was intended to be a rural cemetery, well away from any development, housing and other buildings were built around it anyway. As early as June 1873, a 3-story, 25-room hotel was built across the street from Graceland. By January 1878, a large number of new houses were built near the cemetery. The stench of decomposing bodies, along with the foul taste from the burials left in the local water supply, scared local residents because they already suffered an outbreak of typhoid in 1877. The DC Board of Public Health was worried also, and it commissioned a study of the cemetery in late 1877 to investigate the issue. Although the board said in January 1878 that the cemetery was not responsible for the typhoid outbreak, but it did express its concern that a major burial ground was so close to houses. More than 200 residents signed a petition asking the Board of Public Health to close the cemetery. Another typhoid outbreak in the summer of 1892 intensified the pressure to close Graceland. An investigation by city health officials found that the soil in the southern part of the cemetery was so marshy that graves often filled with water when dug and had to be bailed out before a coffin could be lowered into it. Officials said that the graves were also dug too close to one another so that the walls between graves often collapsed, allowing germs and disease from a nearby decomposing body to wash into a new open grave. Eventually, pressure to close the cemetery became so strong that legislation was introduced in the last days of the 52nd Congress to close the cemetery. The reason why Woodlawn Cemetery was founded was because of the crisis among the black burial grounds. Graceland Cemetery was rapidly surrounded by residential development, and the partially filled cemetery was polluting the local water supply and creating a health hazard. The DC commissioners were pressured to close Graceland in order to accommodate the need for more housing. Between May 1895 and October 1898, nearly 6,000 sets of remains were transferred from Graceland Cemetery to several mass graves at Woodlawn Cemetery. The last major transfer to Woodlawn was from 1939 to 1940, with 139 full and partial sets of remains. There's a dozen mass graves that came to exist at Woodlawn Cemetery. Woodlawn was one of the top-ranked cemeteries for DC's black communities up until the 1950s. But cemetery records were badly kept, and bodies were often buried in the wrong plot. Although Woodlawn said it was an integrated cemetery, being that it accepted burials of both black and white people, internally, however, it was segregated. Caucasians were still being buried in a whites-only section. White burials at Woodlawn were once a significant source of income. That decreased after 1912. Lacking a perpetual care trust, the cemetery fell into disrepair. The last burial was about 1969, and the total number of bodies at the cemetery were about 36,000. The Woodlawn Cemetery Association passed its control to Lewis H. Bell and his son, Richard Bell, in 1961. They planned to restore the cemetery by advertising its historic nature and importance to the black community and generate some income for the restoration. But they discovered that the empty sections of the cemetery still contained burials. Lacking the funds to fully explore the cemetery and determine which spaces remained free, the Bells abandoned their restoration efforts and the cemetery fell further into disrepair. Today there are no more burials at Woodlawn, but there are volunteers to help clean grave markers, clear weeds, and cut the grass at the cemetery in order to keep this ground sacred. Tell me, which cemetery surprised you most? Were you aware that there were at least 3 cemeteries on Benning Road? Were you aware that Payne Cemetery was where the closed Fletcher Johnson Elementary School is now? I found out when I started out as the new kid in the 2nd grade at Fletcher Johnson. I didn't understand why a lot of the kids would tell me to be careful of which floor tile to stand on. They said it was because a hand might pop up through the floor. I didn't get it until one of the older kids explained it to me. That's when I found out about the movie The Poltergeist. I want to thank the KB Strings as my sponsor for this video. If you'd like to sponsor a video, please click the PayPal donation link, or you can just give me a super thanks. Like, subscribe, and share the video if you like the content. I've written down all the suggestions for new videos from the comments, and I will do my research to get that completed. I'm Dickie D, your DC tour guide, and I will see you around Washington.